Hey friends, it's Steven with Leviathan Snakes, and for this week's video, we want to try to answer the question, when you are a brand new ball python breeder and you're acquiring all your animals, should you initially focus on pet level animals, kind of get some clutches under your belt, sell them, and then work your way up? Or should you jump straight towards the higher end side, even though somebody might not want to buy a high-end animal from you because you don't have a name yet? So we have lots of different factors that we want to discuss for this topic, so we hope you guys enjoy the video. If you do, please like, comment, subscribe, but let's jump in it. Personally, I think that it is a good idea to have a blend, so that way you don't have to think of this as an either or, but you can think of it as a spectrum. So that way you have stuff that could serve anybody who potentially would want to buy an animal from you. Now, with that out of the way, let's actually talk about the different factors. And the very first factor, and probably one of the most prominent factors when you are deciding which direction you're going to go, is the investment required to work either side of this kind of equation. So if you are wanting to breed pet level animals, you probably are going to need far less money to do it effectively than you are going to need if you are going to be investing in the higher end side. And this really kind of comes down to the definition of pet level animals. In our opinion, we say that pet level animals are any animal that is $500 or less. And the reason why we kind of say this threshold, even though there might be somebody who wants to buy a $1,000 animal and keep it only as a pet, is that we find it's way more likely for somebody to buy a $200, $300, $400 animal with no intention of breeding at all than it is for somebody to buy a $3,000, $4,000, or $5,000 animal and only have that animal as a pet where they are not planning on trying to make a return from the money that they've invested in it. So if you are wanting to look at the pet versus high-end solely from an idea of how much money do you need to actually get it going, it's definitely in favor of the pet level animals. To do it right, you need way less money to do the pet level side than to do the high-end side right. Now, on the flip side of this is you are investing less money on the pet side, but in return, you are not going to be able to sell those animals for nearly as much money as what you could sell them for the high-end side. So when we are looking at it as the potential to get a profit, the potential to earn a return on the money that you have invested, that 100% very, very easily goes towards the investment, the high-end side of things. And this can get kind of tricky because at first people are thinking like, oh, if I buy an animal for $100, or maybe two animals for $200 total, and I put them together and I get 6 eggs, I'm definitely gonna make more than $200. And that may be true, but what ends up happening is I think that people forget that it costs money to buy the enclosures for the breeders and for the babies. It costs money to feed them every single week. It costs money for electricity. It costs money to vend a show. All of these different things where when you are working on the really, really low end side of the pet level animals, like maybe if you're producing normals and you're selling them for $50 each, then you may actually be losing money breeding those animals because you aren't able to sell them to recoup all of the expenses that you've put into creating them. So when you are working with higher end animals, the profit margins essentially are way better. It costs the exact same amount of money to create a $50 snake as it does to create a $5,000 snake when you are looking at it in terms of enclosures, feed, electricity, all of those kind of expenses. The third thing that we want to talk about is risk. So when we are looking at risk, I think that there are three kind of major elements of risk, and that is the money, straight up financial investment that you are making, that is at risk. You also have time that you're investing into it, and you have effort that you're investing into whatever endeavor you're doing. That's essentially at risk. And the reason why your time and your effort are at risk, because if you spend 3 years trying to do something and you take a bunch of effort, that means that you're probably not spending that 3 years trying to work some other opportunity, and you're not putting your efforts into a different opportunity that could potentially get you a stronger, better return at the end of the day. And because of that, you have risk both on the actual straight up money that you're investing as well as the opportunities that you are losing by doing it. So I say all of this because I personally think that from a brand new breeder, you shouldn't be as concerned about the opportunity cost, the opportunity risk, even though it is a risk. I think that that comes later on. That's like once you've already been established and you learn like, okay, I am going to be doing this and it is good for me. So then opportunity risk becomes more important because you have to understand how you can best optimize your business in order to achieve the greatest return possible. But initially, when when you're brand new and you're first starting off, I think the most important risk is that financial risk. And because the high-end side has a much, much higher price tag than the pet level side, I think that there is greater risk for working the high-end side originally because, again, you may not be able to sell the animals, or you may invest thousands upon thousands of dollars into the animals, and because you're not experienced enough, there may be something that ends up happening that kills the whole clutches of your first season because your incubator wasn't set up properly, or maybe that there's a rack fire and it kills all the animals. Anyways, with the high-end side, you have more at stake financially, so there is a higher risk for the financial side. So when it comes to risk, I'm going to give the edge to the pet level animals. Next one is accessibility, because when you are working on the higher end side of animals versus the pet level side, part of the reason why the higher end animals have a much higher price tag is that they are much, much more rare. So because they are more rare, they're more scarce, it might not be possible to find the exact animal that works for you. And because of this, the pet level animals often have a much greater supply. Their prices are much lower. You can probably find them at local shows fairly easily, something that would work with your plans. The pet level animals are way more accessible. So because of this, we're going to give the edge again to pet level animals are being more accessible, so it's easier to get into. Sales avenues is our next one. And sales avenues, this is talking about like where can you go as a new breeder to sell your animals? And I think that the three biggest avenues, at least that we've seen to sell our animals, have been morph market, shows, and social media. So social media, I think, it requires a lot of effort, and it's kind of what you are able to make out of it, and there's a bit of luck, so I'm not actually going to include social media on this discussion. I think that for new ball python breeders that don't have a reputation yet, morph market isn't probably the best place for it, because often morph market, I think that people are going towards other breeders that have stronger reputations, and they're often looking out very, very specific genetics, and they're finding those animals that fit their projects. And because of this, if you're a brand new breeder, especially if you're going on the pet level side, you probably aren't going to be producing the animals that those types of people, those other breeders who are on morph market, are looking for. So your morph market might not be as successful. On the flip of that, if we are looking at the high-end side, you might be able to produce animals that people are specifically searching for on morph market, but if you're brand new and you don't have a name, again, they may not be comfortable buying from you because they don't want to risk the chance that they are going to get scammed. Instead, they would rather go to somebody who's more established in the hobby. I personally think that when it comes to brand new breeders, local shows are probably one of your best options for selling animals, and at local shows, the higher end animals don't really sell that well because at specifically local shows, most of the people who are willing to buy a higher end animal are other breeders, so realistically, that's the other vendors that are there. And if those vendors are not buying your specific animals, the majority of the people who go to local shows are from the general public, and they're coming in looking for pet level animals, so sub $500. So I think going from a new breeder perspective, I think that you have a better shot of selling your animals at local shows than you are going to sell them on morph market or social media. And because local shows is your best avenue for selling them, and local shows are better at selling pet level animals than they are at selling high end, we are going to give the edge of sales avenues again to pet level animals. I know that investment level animals only has 1 point, while pet animals has 4 right now, but I think that is going to start switching once we start looking into these different categories coming up next. The next thing that we want to talk about is the animal care. Realistically, it's the effort that you have to invest in caring for pet level animals versus high-end animals. And realistically, a ball python is a ball python, and it's the same level of effort either way. But if you have a pet level business, you very, very likely are going to end up having lots and lots and lots of lower end animals that only can be sold for $200, $300, maybe $500 on like your higher end side of sales. When it comes to the higher end animals, because the animals cost so much more money and they're so much more scarce than appropriate pet level animals, you're probably going to have far less animals. And because of this, that's less time that you have to invest in cleaning them, changing water dishes, making sure you have appropriate enclosures for them, all of those different things. So when it comes to animal care, I think that you can do the same volume of sales with smaller amounts of animals with the higher end than the pets. So we're going to give the edge to higher end animals. If time is a resource that you're limited on because you are looking at a full-time job or kids or something like that, the higher end side may be something that is really important to you. Touching on something that we just talked about is infrastructure. So for the higher end side, you can have less animals to earn the same amount of sales volume as you would need pet level animals. And because you need less animals on the higher end side, that means you need less enclosures. And because you need less enclosures, that's less of an investment you are going to have to make on the enclosure side. So we are going to give the edge on enclosures to the high end. You can keep less animals for higher kind of profit margins in the same enclosures that you would keep the pet level animals. But because you have more pet level animals to hit appropriate kind of sales goals, you're going to need way more enclosures, and you're probably going to end up spending more money on enclosures than you would for the high end side. The last one that kind of ties here into the upkeep of the animals is feed. So again, directly tying back to the amount of animals that you have. If you have, let's say, 100 pet level animals versus 20 high-end animals, it is going to be way more expensive to feed those 100 pet level animals than it is to feed the 20 high-end animals. And because of this, that means that you are going to need to either breed your own rodents, which will have a whole level of different effort in time and stuff like that, expenses that are associated with breeding your own, or you're going to have to buy them from a rodent producer, which if you don't have a solid rodent producer in your area, this may be difficult as well. Maybe you can find somebody who can breed rodents, but they can't supply you consistently with 100 a week, but they could do 20 a week. So it's different things like this that you need to be aware of. So when it comes to the feeding of the animals, the edge goes to the high-end side. At this point in our breakdown, both categories are tied with 4 points each. So now we're going to kind of shift away from just the straight up animals, and we're going to kind of talk about the business. And one of the things that I want to talk about is like the skills / the knowledge needed to work either the pet side or the high-end side appropriately in order to get the best return possible. And I think when it comes to the pet level side, I think it's more simple. Realistically, when it comes to pets, the animals that sell the best, that sell for the best price point are bananas, bells, and pies. And you can have different combinations in there, like a banana cinnamon versus a regular banana, or a banana clown mail maker versus a regular banana, or things like that. You can have nuance for it, but realistically, a banana cinnamon is going to outsell way faster and for more money a cinnamon inchie. And it doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with a cinnamon inchie, but both of these types of animals, both of these different combinations for ball pythons fall in the pet level range, but there are certain animals that are way more popular and have a much stronger demand in the pet level range, and I think it is much, much easier to find those animals with the strongest pet level demand than it is to find high-end animals with the strongest demand. So because of this, I think to find high-end animals with the best demand, honestly, it changes very quickly. Season to season it changes, and it's very possible that you will invest thousands upon thousands of dollars into a specific animal, and then by the time that you are able to produce a clutch, nobody really cares about that gene anymore. And by nobody really cares, I'm saying that the prices have dropped dramatically. Most people who already had the gene are already working it, so they don't need to buy more stuff, things like this. So I think that when it comes to the skill / the knowledge required, you need way more skill, you need way more knowledge about the market and the morphs in the industry to work the high-end side right. And because of that, I'm going to give the edge to the pet level side. I think it's easier to understand the pet level side and easier to know what you should make that will sell the best to pet keepers. Tying into who's going to buy what is the market size for pet level animals and the market size for high-end animals. When you look at the biggest ball python breeder channels, like specifically about breeding ball pythons, they are a tiny fraction of what the biggest channels are on the pet side. And because of this, I think it's a really, really strong data point to show that there is a massive market, there's a massive volume of people who would be willing to consider owning a ball python as a pet. And while there is a big market for people who are into high-level side of breeding, it is a much, much smaller one when you are comparing it to the pet market. So when looking at just straight up market size, the pet side of the equation is 100% weighted in its favor, so it's gonna get the point here. The next factor that we want to talk about is the demand for pet level animals and the demand for high-end animals. And while the pet side has a much much, much bigger market size, I think that there is a far stronger demand for high-end animals than there is for pet animals. And I think that this kind of makes sense. So when we are looking at the demand for a pet level animal, the people who are buying this are buying it as a pet. They are wanting to have maybe their very first reptile, or they have a couple other reptiles, and it's more of a luxury item to them. They don't need this specific animal. They might want it, but they don't need it. So because of this, I think that the pet side is more temperamental when it comes to economic conditions, because if people don't have discretionary income, they're not going to go out and look for a brand new $300 pet. In addition to this, I think that there's way more competition when it comes to the pet level side, because it's very, very easy to recreate a banana single gene male. And if you can make a banana single gene male, so can everybody else who are making pet level animals. And because of that, there's way more chances for a potential customer to choose a banana from you or from your competitor or anything like this. And because of that, it means the demand for your banana, single gene banana goes down and down and down. And this is part of what drives the pet level prices down so low. So all of this said, when you are looking at the high-end side, high-end is much more scarce than the pet side. In addition, the prices are much higher, and the people who are wanting to buy those animals are breeders. So they often have very, very specific goals for what they are trying to accomplish. So they need a perfect combination of genes. And if you have the animal that has the exact perfect combination of genes that they're looking for, the demand for that animal is so high because nobody else has it. So when it comes to the demand, there is a much, much stronger demand for the high-end snakes than there are for pet snakes, so the edge goes to the high-end side of breeding. Next one is scalability. So again, we're looking at this from the perspective of a brand new ball python breeder who wants to turn this into their full-time business at some point. So when it comes to the pet side, in order to scale it up to the point that you could have it as a full-time income, you need hundreds upon hundreds, if not thousands of snakes, because if you are making $200 to $300 snakes on average, that means that you are going to need 100 snakes in order to make $30,000 a year, which I feel like for most places, at least in America, that is not enough to like genuinely live off of. Instead, you're probably going to be needing to make like $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 because you also have to pay taxes and you have to factor in all of the expenses required to create that $60,000, $70,000 worth of revenue from the animals. So because of this, you are going to need a lot more snakes, and it's going to be much, much harder to scale, because not only are you going to need more snakes, you're going to need more expenses in food, you're going to need more expenses in electricity, you're going to need more expenses when it comes to enclosures. You're probably not going to be able to breed pet level animals up to the point of a full-time business in your home, so you're probably going to have to either purchase a facility or build a facility. And overall, I personally do not think that it is feasible to scale a full-time reptile breeding business up from the ground up solely on pet level animals in 2023. I personally think that if somebody tried to do this solely on pet level animals, they would burn out way before they'd ever get to the point of sustainability, and they would leave the hobby altogether. And because of this, essentially, it's taking all of the work, all of the effort, all of the time that they have spent, all of the money they've spent, invested into it, and just throwing it down the drain. And this is like the thing that I wanted to talk about when we talked about the risk. So even though I personally think starting out, the investment side has a higher financial risk, I think that if you're trying to turn a pet level business into a full-time operation, you have a much, much higher risk of not actually achieving that goal because of this right here. It's way harder to scale a pet level business up to the point to support yourself with a full-time income. Now, on the flip side of this, the high-end snakes, it is much easier to scale it because you're working with a much, much smaller volume of animals. It's easier to go from 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 animals up to the point where you can have a full-time income, because I personally think that you can do a full-time income breeding high-end snakes with let's say 30 to 50 clutches a year. And that is way more doable than trying to do 300 to 500 clutches a year of low-end snakes. So the edge here on scalability 100% very, very easily goes to the high-end side of breeding. The last one on here, we kind of touched about it just now, is longevity. I think that the people who get into the pet level animals have a much greater risk of getting out, and they don't actually last in order to hit all of their goals and make it a full-time business, because it's so hard. It takes so much time, it takes so much effort, and the ultimate reward just isn't really worth it when you are trying to breed $200 and $300 snakes together to make more $200 and $300 snakes. What ends up happening is that there's going to be setbacks, and eventually there's going to be an emergency, there's going to be a life event that changes, and you're going to realize that if you're focusing on the pet level side, that if you really want to make this into a business, you are going to have to completely restructure your collection and work more towards the higher end side of things, and that can discourage people, and that can get people to get out because they felt like that they had made the wrong choices already. Now, I personally think that the higher end side does not necessarily mean that you are going to stay in longer, but you are avoiding a lot of the common things that make people get out by working on the higher end side initially. So I don't think that you should initially just jump in and go for a $20,000 snake, but I think that if you are working on the higher end side, like focusing on the animals that people that breeders would want, it is way easier to stay in longer because it's less likely you're going to get overwhelmed. It's less likely you're going to get burnt out. And overall, you will have a better chance of lasting. And if you can last, it's a marathon, not a sprint, is something that you hear often in the reptile community. You will be able to achieve your goals. So all of this said, let me count this up real quick. After considering all 13 different factors, we have 6 in favor of the pet level side, and we have 7 in favor of the investment side. I personally believe that the sooner that you start working on the investment level animals, and this doesn't mean $20,000 animals, but I would say like $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 animals and up, the more likely it is that you are going to be able to achieve the goal of turning your reptile passion into a full-time reptile business. So we hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please like, comment, subscribe, and we will see you next week.